Good morning, everyone. My name is Hanak, and I'm the director of PPIC's Water Policy Center. Thanks so much for tuning into our program on farmland in transition in the San Joaquin Valley. As many of you know, for some years now, PPIC's Water Policy Center has been working with many partners from around the valley and across the state to look at solutions to the enormous water challenges facing the valley. This region is home to 4 million people and about 5 million acres of irrigated cropland, and it produces over half of the state's farm output. It's also ground zero for California's water challenges, including bringing severely overdrafted groundwater basins into balance and addressing the effects of the more intense droughts we're getting as the climate warms. In past work, we showed that new water supply investments, especially groundwater recharge, could help fill some of the deficit caused by long-term overdraft. We also showed that demand management actions would be necessary, with the likelihood of at least 500,000 acres of cropland needing to come out of irrigated production by the early 2040s to secure the region's groundwater for the long term. We're now looking at options for managing this farmland transition in ways that can be most beneficial for the region's communities, economy, and environment. And today we're really pleased to share the first 2 reports from this project. We'll be releasing additional reports on other land use alternatives and policy and planning considerations over the coming year. So today, first we're going to hear from Katie Peterson. She's going to be sharing the findings of a new report that looks at the potential for farming some transitioning lands with dry land farming techniques. These are techniques relying just on winter rains, or with a very small amount of irrigation to top that off, what this team calls water limited farming. Next, we're going to hear an overview from Andrew Ayres of a study that he and colleagues did to look at a question on many people's minds when they think of widespread land fallowing, which is how to manage the increased risk of dust, which is a major public health concern in this region. Both of these reports, as well as slides from the presentations, are available on the PPIC website at ppic.org. And then after Katie and Andrew's presentations, I'm going to be moderating a discussion with a really great panel of local experts to talk about the findings and next steps and where we go from here. So we'd like to thank the following funders for supporting this research and today's event. That includes the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the California Strategic Growth Council's Climate Change Research Program with funds from California Climate Investments, the Morgan Family Foundation, and USDA's Office of Environmental Markets. And finally, a few housekeeping items. First, as a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for office. Second, at the end of today's program, we've set aside some time to answer audience questions. So we'd really love to hear from you. If you have a question for our panelists or the authors, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Please include your name and your organization so that we can acknowledge you. Now, I'd like to invite my colleague, Associate Director of the Water Policy Center and Research Fellow, Katie Peterson, to present the findings from her recent report. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate that nice introduction. And so I'm going to kick us off by sharing the first part of our research that explores the potential for water-limited agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. This was an effort that was led by myself, as well as a team of agronomists and soil scientists at UC Davis. Cameron Piddlecow and Mark Lundy. Kate Scow participated in the conceptualization of the research, and we had support from Joy Collins on our team here at the Water Policy Center. So as Ellen mentioned in her intro, there's a lot of land in the San Joaquin Valley that may go fallow as irrigated cropland is getting squeezed from a number of different angles. And we wanted to know, are there better outcomes than that? So is there a role for dry land or water limited agriculture, for example, to ease this transition to less irrigation? And a lot of people had this question about dry land agriculture because we used to do a lot of it in the valley, particularly winter wheat and barley. So we know it's possible here in some form. To what extent might it be possible to reintroduce it? And is that something we would want to do? So as a little sneak peek for what we found on this, our models showed that it is possible to grow winter crops without much irrigation or even with no irrigation, especially in wetter areas of the valley. But having just a few inches of irrigation to get a winter crop started, to help it through droughty periods, really makes a big difference in terms of feasibility. And when we took a look at the economics of water limited winter wheat, we found that harvesting this crop as a forage product rather than a grain tended to be a safer bet in terms of breaking even on operating costs. Water limited forage crops are not very costly to implement. They tend to need not very many inputs, and under a range of commodity prices, they could be good for the bottom line, as well as a relatively high value use of water. And that's especially if they can be managed in a way that keeps overhead low. And finally, beyond these financial motivators, such as there are a number of reasons why we might be interested in implementing these systems beyond that, including things such as soil health, as well as human health by tamping down dust, which is what my colleague Andrew will explore a little bit in the next section. So before I go any further, what do we mean by dryland? What do we mean by water limited? Dryland crops, what we mean by that is crops grown only with rainfall and soil water, and that typically refers to production that happens in the semi-arid areas of the world, including California, where that normally happens in the winter, and water limited. So we wanted to look not just at dryland crops in the strict sense, but also at these crops supported by a few inch of irrigation. So much less than a normally irrigated crop, but still very water stressed in many ways. So for that, we use the term water limited. So can winter crops still be grown in the San Joaquin Valley with no irrigation? As I said, we used to do a lot of dryland farming in the valley. It's pretty uncommon now. We do still see a lot of irrigated wheat, and some growers will plant some dryland wheat in the winter as just part of a healthy soil rotation, but that's about the extent of it. So how much potential is there for reintroducing these systems as the valley adapts to its water situation? The task for us was really to figure out how to answer that when there's not a lot of field data to inform us, or at least recent field data. So for that reason, we used a modeling approach to simulate some crop growth and establishment scenarios for a couple of sites in the valley, which are indicated on the map on the right. And we also did a lot of talking to growers and other experts in this world, including folks from other regions with similar climate conditions that also do a lot of dryland agriculture. And we know right off the bat, obviously, water is going to be a big factor in what we're able to do. So the map on the right shows the variability in average annual rainfall across the San Joaquin Valley. And of course, there's a lot of spatial variability as you go from north to south, and also as you go from east to west. But there's also a lot of variability just from day to day and season to season. So when you're growing crops that rely on that rainfall, that makes it very difficult and very risky. So what are we looking at here? These maps are showing us the likelihood that you would be able to attain a winter wheat forage yield of 5 tons in any given year. So why 5 tons? That's the yield level that we've estimated stands a pretty good chance of allowing you to break even, given a range of operating costs and commodity prices. And in this case, we're looking at hay in particular. So without irrigation, that's the map on the left-hand side, the left-hand panel. In a lot of the valley, you'll get to that level in maybe 40% or less of years. So in most years, the crop will fail without irrigation. But in wetter areas of the valley, like up in the northeast, you may have more success. However, if you look at the middle panel and the right-hand panel, you'll see that even with just one application of 4 inches of irrigation, and even a little more so with 8 inches, you have a lot better luck. And this is, again, for 5 tons of forage yield, but we found that actually in the wetter areas on this map, the averages were actually more like 6 to 7 tons. So that's what our models tell us about the potential for these crops from an agronomy standpoint, but there are also economic and operational constraints to consider. The price point for these crops, for example, is not usually comparable to something like almonds that we're very familiar with now. These are low input, low output type systems, which is a big mindset shift, as well as a system transformation from the high input, high output crops that we're really used to. On the other hand, If we're thinking about forage crops, there is potential for some sustained demand from the dairy industry, for example. Hay prices this year, great example, they're at abnormal highs. So there are some scenarios where they're a really good prospect. And I'll just note that our analysis was not using prices for this year. So what I'm reporting here is more reflective of more normal averages, I'll say. And then as far as farm operations go, there are still some questions as to how the cost of maintaining irrigation systems, the labor, may influence the ability to put just a few inches of irrigation on a dry land crop. And then there are other factors that are not really captured by our modeling. Things like the possibility that salt accumulation may grow worse if we don't have the high volumes of irrigation water to perform leaching, or that we might run into perennial weed pressure over time if we don't have the operating budgets to really deal with that effectively. So there's a lot to keep in mind going forward. Despite these constraints, when it comes to lands that are going to be losing reliable irrigation, our perspective on this is that something might be preferable to nothing. And there are other reasons why we might see continued interest in these systems as an alternative to fallowing. One is the public benefit creation that I mentioned earlier. Dust mitigation is a big one here. And there are also others, like the potential to provide some surrogate habitat for wildlife, especially as things like alfalfa start to decline in acreage. And then there are also private benefits to the grower other than the potential for crop revenue. And that includes maintaining soil quality, just part of the reason dryland wheat is included in the rotation currently. It also allows you to keep your land operational for future agricultural use. And more importantly, in my perspective, is building flexibility into farm operations, which is really a key to resilience. You can harvest these types of crops for different products, depending on the kind of year it's turning out to be. You can sacrifice the crop if it's a flood year, for example, or you can use it to just provide grazing material if you know your yields are going to be too low for a harvest. And then one surprising result and perhaps interesting benefit to explore further is the net water use of these crops. So especially when we're talking about very water stressed crops or dryland crops, we found that their net water use may be pretty similar, or at least not that much more than a fallow field. And I know, for example, groundwater sustainability agencies might have questions about this when it comes to how to incentivize land cover, how to incentivize good land stewardship while still getting the benefits that they need for groundwater demand reduction. So that's another thing that we're going to want to keep an eye on going forward. So to wrap up, building off the last 2 points, the main takeaways we have from this work in terms of policy. First, at the federal and state level, there are some scenarios where water limited crops could pay for themselves, as I've illustrated, but there are also many scenarios where they will not. So it makes sense for additional carrots to be available, given the benefits that are anticipated for the public. And second, at the local level, it'll be important to think more about accounting for net water use of fallow land relative to water limited crops. For example, when GSAs are putting together allocation budgets and structuring water credits for fallowing programs. And then on the research side, there's a lot more that can be done. Our work was very exploratory. Models are a good way to see what's possible without burning too many calories, but they really should be accompanied by solid field work to be grounded in reality. So these tactics need to be trialed on farm, and there's a lot of opportunity to learn from growers and managers that are already experimenting with these systems. More work needs to be done on the market and financial questions, including the value of the benefits that we're interested in. Better crop varieties and management innovations are needed, those that are adapted to drought, adapted to water stress. And we shouldn't limit ourselves to wheat. There are broader horizons in terms of the crop and land use portfolio that we're thinking about, lots of other winter crops and drought adapted crops that could potentially do better than wheat. And I'll close by noting that there's also room to think about what other non-irrigated agricultural uses we could draw on for transitioning lands, and that includes rangelands and other grazing systems. So I'll close with that and just remind you that if you have any questions about this presentation or the work in general, please email them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Andrew Ayres, who's a research fellow here at our team on the Water Policy Center.
Hello there. Thanks, Katie, for that great introduction. I'm going to be talking with everybody here today about land transitions and the potential risks for dust that come along with those. This is joint work with Jae-Min Kwon at Fresno State University in the Department of Public Health, as well as Joy Collins here in the Water Policy Center here at PPIC. We also received research support from Elisa Gonzalez and Zaira Joaquin Morales. And I'd also, before we start, like to thank a number of different stakeholders, agency representatives, land managers who took part in workshops with us and really shared their perspectives and helped us, help guide and formulate this research. With that, I'll get started. The San Joaquin Valley stands to gain a lot of long-term benefits from more sustainably managing its groundwater. But along with this, there may come some risks. And in particular, if poorly managed, fallowed lands that are taken out of irrigated production in order to save on groundwater can generate a number of nuisances, like weeds and, importantly, dust. Now, increased dust exposure in the valley is going to be really important because dust can lead to a number of poor health outcomes, including respiratory, cardiovascular, and including developmental impairments in infants and children. One of the key takeaways from our research is that principally some of these negative effects are going to be borne by rural communities throughout the valley that tend to be low income. So we've identified some key points for coordinated action moving forward, and they include clarifying responsibilities about who needs to do what about dust, identifying potential hotspots for dust problems moving forward, and providing robust, reliable funding support to make improvements happen. But when we talk about dust, what exactly are we talking about? So dust, as we term it in the report, is going to be part of a broader category of pollutants known as particulate matter. Now, particulates come in different sizes, they come from different sources, but two key distinctions are particulates that can be inhaled by humans that are smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter and smaller than 10 microns in diameter. Especially when we're thinking about that second category, PM10, landscape sources are really important. The sources shown on the right-hand side of this slide, mainly from agricultural operations and from wind-blown dust from the landscape, can make up to 60% of PM10 in the valley. And it's also really important to think about landscape sources of dust because the valley has made progress on PM10 concentrations in recent decades, lowering them over time and meeting new federal standards. And a lot of these improvements have come about by better managing dust from the landscape. So we're going to need to continue that momentum as particulate matter concentrations in the valley are at risk of increasing. On the one hand, because of more intense and frequent wildfires, and on the other hand, due to the fallowing that we expect to see under SGMA that can present a risk for increased emissions. It's important also to note that in the valley, dust can contain some additional health risks beyond the standard ones that we think about in terms of respiratory and cardiovascular health. In particular, dust in the valley can contain fungal spores that lead to infections that cause valley fever, a potentially highly disruptive, if not fatal, infection amongst those who come down with it. And because many of these lands coming out of production will formerly have been in irrigated agricultural uses, legacy pesticides carried by the dust present another potential risk. So to get a better handle on what this looks like in the valley, we went ahead and we looked at some other cases from across the American West where agricultural land transitions have been managed especially to take care of dust. The first was in the Imperial Valley, where a fallowing program took several thousand acres of land out of production, and they had a best management practice program to control dust on those lands. The Antelope Valley, also in California, where taking land out of agricultural production and long-term overgrazing led to severe and acute dust problems. And then also we took some lessons from experiences in Eastern Washington managing dust production on lands that were intermittently fallowed as part of an agricultural production rotation. You can read more about these cases in the report, but to distill some high-level takeaways, we identified 4 key ingredients for success. The first is funding, not only to support coordinated efforts to manage dust at scale, but also to compensate landowners for managing dust from their own parcels. The second is monitoring, not only to ensure compliance with any regulations for managing dust, but also to be able to document success or failure. And finally, innovation to help make sure that cost-effective solutions are developed that fit sort of the needs of the location. And some luck, especially where the primary method for controlling dust on these lands is going to involve establishing vegetative cover on them in the absence of water. Sometimes precipitation from the sky is your best friend. But these are broad principles for success. And so another thing we did was use some data to look a little bit more closely at what this transition and what the risks might look like in the valley itself. And it's important to note that the valley already has a history of large dust events that cause damage and health impacts, especially during times of drought. So one of the questions that we wanted to sort of drill in on a little bit was, what's going to be the net effect of idling lands that formerly were in agricultural production? There have been some concerns that especially orchards do tend to generate a lot of dust by themselves. So we investigated using data on particulate matter concentrations and land cover, what might be the net effect of transitioning from, say, annual crops or orchards to idle land. And we find that the effects of idling vary primarily by what the primary land cover was or the prior land cover was, as well as what the time of year is. And in particular, in most cases, it would be expected that idling land and allowing it to go fallow might increase dust emissions, except during periods of harvest for some tree crops, during which emissions spike because things like almonds are harvested from the ground, and that generates a lot of dust. One of the other key takeaways from this work was that rural areas are going to be more exposed, and increasingly as the climate becomes more arid, this might compound those risks in rural areas. But it is also true that within the valley, certain rural areas might face heightened risk relative to others. So we can actually map this risk geography, and we did that, and I can show you on this next slide. What you're seeing here are two different maps of the San Joaquin Valley. On the left-hand side, we've identified rural communities throughout the valley and categorized them by their underlying dust risk. So this dust risk is made up of two components. The first is the type of soils that surround these communities, how erosive they are. So more erosive, higher dust risk. And the other component is the pre-existing level of particulate matter concentrations around these communities. On the right-hand side of the map, you'll see some preliminary estimates of how much fallowing we might expect within a couple miles of these communities based on hydroeconomic modeling that we're undertaking as part of this project. So the goal here is to present one approach for how someone might think about identifying hotspots in the valley. Some key takeaways here are that, as you can see on the left-hand, in the left-hand map, dust risk is clustered spatially. This has largely to do with clustering of the types of soils that tend to be more erosive in the valley. And in fact, over 40% of the communities identified here are at high risk due to the types of soils around them. Amongst those communities that are at high risk, we estimate, based on the right-hand map, that about 75% of them are going to expect some fallowing under sigma. So this is just a very illustrative example of how someone could go about doing this, but combining information on dust risk with expected fallowing estimates can allow stakeholders and other planning agencies to think about where are hotspots and how might we address them upfront. So we've identified that there are some risks here throughout the valley. What can be done to minimize them? One thing we found in the course of our research was that maintaining management practices on the land that disrupt wind are really, really important for reducing the amount of dust that's generated from fallowed or idled lands. And in fact, simply maintaining some vegetative cover is often the simplest and most cost-effective approach. Unfortunately, some of these lands are coming out of production because there isn't water available to irrigate them and perhaps not establish vegetative cover. But Katie talked a little bit just earlier about how there are opportunities for dryland agriculture, or even with a small amount, 4 to 8 inches of supplemental irrigation to establish the kind of vegetative cover that could largely address the problem. In other areas where even that might not be feasible, there are opportunities to cover the ground with things like gravel or mulch and thus disrupt dust generation processes. And although these are more costly, they can in some cases provide longer term benefits. But also to provide a strong foundation moving forward, it's important to make sure that we prioritize ongoing improvements on working lands, so lands that remain in agricultural production, in order to address rural dust problems more broadly than just focusing on parcels that may come out of production. The San Joaquin Valley Air District's Conservation Management Practice Program has set up rules and expectations for how agricultural producers would manage dust on their land, and this has helped in recent decades. It'll be important for that program to evolve and continue supporting reductions on agricultural landscapes moving forward, reductions in dust generation. So to sum up, we think the Valley right now is at a point in SGMA implementation where it has an opportunity to really get out ahead of this problem. And we identify sort of three main areas or actions that can help Valley stakeholders do that. The first is to note that monitoring of rural particulate matter concentrations is fairly limited. So there's a need to improve understanding of this fundamental dust risk in rural areas. Stakeholders are going to need tools to identify hotspots, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, as well as to document where there are successes or emerging acute problems. There's a potential role for CARB, the California Air Resources Board, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Regional Air District to collaborate here to understand where new investments in monitoring might yield the most benefit. Second, there's a need to clarify GSA and landowner responsibilities for mitigating dust. At the GSA level, there's some uncertainty about whether projects and actions that foresee fallowing of farmland would be subject to CEQA requirements and thus need to mitigate dust at the programmatic scale. At the landowner level, there is the Conservation Management Practice Program from the Regional Air District that I mentioned a moment ago, which currently foresees fallowing as a dust management solution. This program is currently being updated and will need to evolve essentially to take into account the fact that 500,000 or more acres of agricultural land are going to come out of irrigated production over the next few decades. And finally, bringing it back to our key ingredients for success, we identified sustainable, robust funding programs as an important piece of all of this. There are some existing opportunities through agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service or the state's Department of Conservation to help fund solutions on these lands that may help to resolve the dust problem. But there may be a need for new programs as well. And in that event, I think the Regional Air Quality District has a couple of ongoing programs to help support the adoption of low dust nut harvesters on orchards and to help phase out agricultural burning in the Valley that can act as really good models for how to cost effectively disperse funding to generate some of these public benefits. So with that, I'll stop and I'll just remind you that we are going to have a Q&A session later after the panel. So if you do have questions for our panelists or for either of the presenters, you can send those to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ellen for the panel.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was great. A really good overview. And so now I'm excited to bring up a really terrific panel of local experts. I'm going to call them all up with a very short introduction. If you want more details on the amazing work that they're doing, you can find the links to their bios on the PPIC event page. So first, I'd like to welcome up Reyn Akiona. Reyn is an ecologist, and he is the watershed coordinator of the Tule Subbasin down in Tulare County. That is only one of many hats that he wears. So I'm sure that we can get him to answer questions with some of his other hats. I'll just give you a hint. He is involved in native seed production, among other things. Next, we're going to bring up Mark Hutson, who is a longtime grower in the Valley. Right now, managing a farm with walnuts and almonds. And I'm just going to give a hint here. Right now, a little bit of dryland wheat too. He is based in Chowchilla, in the Chowchilla Basin in Madera County. So a little bit further north on the east side of the Valley. from where Reyn is mainly working. Next, Jonathan Klassen, who is the Director of Air Quality Science with the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. That's the district that Andrew has been evoking many times in his presentation about playing a key role on all of this stuff. Welcome, John. And last but not least, Cork McIsaac, who is the President of Agricultural Industries, Inc. He provides a lot of land management services across the state, really, across the valley, and that includes managing a big chunk of lands that no longer have irrigation on the west side of the valley, over in the Westlands area of Fresno and Kings County. And Cork is also a grower in his own right. Welcome, everybody, and thanks so much for being here. So I want to start us off kind of with a little follow-up from the last presentation from Andrew, and I want us to start with John and just elaborate a little bit for us on the dust picture in the valley, and in particular, the role that the Air District has been playing in encouraging land managers to help bring down dust. And Andrew mentioned the CMP program, I'm not even going to be able to remember how to spell that out, but tell us a little bit about that and how you're thinking about adapting it at this moment in time.
Right, great. Thank you, Ellen, for the introduction, and really happy to be here this morning. As you know, the San Joaquin Valley has a number of challenges when it comes to air quality. We're in a bowl. We have mountain ranges to the east, to the west, to the south of us. We have weather conditions in the summer and the winter that places a lid over the bowl of the valley. So in those conditions, emissions can build up quickly and lead to higher concentrations of different pollutants. But despite those challenges, we've been working very hard to reduce those emissions, improve air quality. We are in attainment of most of the federal air quality standards. That includes PM10, which we'll talk about in a minute. We also attained the 1 hour ozone standard. We're the first and only region to be classified as extreme non-attainment to then attain a standard. So we're making progress with ozone, continuing to make progress with PM 2.5 as well, the most challenging standard. Just to talk a bit more about the PM10 standard that we attained a number of years ago, this was all driven from an attainment plan that we put together that had a number of measures and strategies within there to reduce emissions from internal combustion engines, glass melting furnaces, and ag operations to reduce dust. And from this plan came our Conservation Management Practices Rule, our CMP rule, our Rule 4550. And we work closely with the ag community and stakeholders on this rule. And this rule requires that measures be taken for ag operations to reduce dust through conservation tillage practices, trying to combine different activities in one pass on the field to reduce dust during the operation of those ag activities. Cover cropping is another option. And so through the implementation of that rule over the years, we've reduced PM10 emissions by over 35 tons. And that went a long way to help us attain that federal PM10 standard. I did want to mention too that recently we put together our latest attainment plan for the PM 2.5 federal standards. And within that plan, we made a commitment to again look at our CMP rule to think about what else can we do to further reduce emissions of PM10 and PM 2.5 from ag operations through looking at that rule. I wanted to mention too that in our current rule, fallowing land is an option for a CMP that an operation can undertake. So instead of working the land that can generate dust, they have the option of fallowing the land with the intention that could be less dust than working the land. But of course, with the implementation of SGMA, with up to 500,000 acres going fallow in the coming years, we're rethinking that rule right now. We're working through it. The research from this project is going to really lead well to us looking at it further to see what practices can we employ to help fallow land reduce any blowing dust and reducing those concerns. So a lot of the information in the report we'll be looking at closely. This could lead to more research, understanding what practices really would work well here in the valley, the cost of those, and that can help build up a good strategy going forward.
Thanks, John. That's terrific. Okay, so I think we're going to go right over to some of our land managers now to kind of get a little bit of a sense from them. This has already been part of their consideration in managing land is the dust piece, and I think of all of them, Cork has been probably grappling with these issues front and center in a big and challenging way with managing the lands on the west side in an area it's pretty dry, those are lands that don't have access to irrigation generally. So Cork, what worries you about kind of not managing the land or letting the land go to seed, and what are your most valuable approaches right now?
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, really, from our perspective, because we're surrounded by existing or ongoing operations, and we're tasked with making sure we protect those operations from pests getting, whether it be bugs or weeds that can develop on those fallowed lands. Probably our main tool has been mechanical management, which would be disking and then some shredding. We don't use a lot of spraying to control any of those pests. The challenge is obviously by leaving those grounds disc is it's open ground, and so you have the risk of having more dust from those lands. We've done some. We do try and do as much, and working with our tenants to do as much dry land farming as possible. Unfortunately, we've been in fairly dry phase for probably the last 15 years, and it's made it pretty challenging to get crops, and especially from a grain standpoint. And a lot of that has been utilized for forage grazing, primarily sheep and goats, and that's effective, but not a very. It's not necessarily a real effective way to control the weeds from a timing standpoint. Mainly because for grazing you need to spread that season as long as possible, but those plants become hosts for numerous pests, and then that becomes a secondary challenge. There's no real easy answers. Funding is ideally any grower that's out there would much prefer to be able to come up with programs that don't require government assistance. But at this point, unless there's water available, which is not on the horizon, there's going to need to be some broader discussions and availability of resources to help manage these, to try and mitigate some of the secondary issues that come out with, such as dust, et cetera.
Thanks, Cork. And I mean, you're highlighting really one of these tough trade-offs between kind of managing for weeds and the pests that they host, and managing for dust. That it can be hard to find that sweet spot, and especially to do it when you don't have much water. I think I know what your answer is going to be, but since Katie and her team have put forward this idea of kind of adding a few inches of irrigation, if you could if you can get it to really aid with crop establishment with a dry land crop. Just wondering what your thoughts are. If I realize it's not the sort of typical way people manage now, but
Right.
if you had access to that, would you do it, or what would your considerations be?
Yeah, I think it's something that you can look at. The realities on the ground is the water is going to go and is going to be utilized for its highest value from an agronomic standpoint, for its highest value. And so this is where I think that broader policy needs to come into play, is where those funds are available to either buy that excess water or to reach out and try and buy, and I don't want to say excess water because there really is no excess water, but to be able to buy some water to be able to then help mitigate some of those dry conditions in different areas. And I think I don't think you would do it on every acre of ground, but you would look at certain areas where it's most effective. And then I think we'll touch on it a little bit later, is utilizing groundwater recharge potentially to help mitigate that, and utilizing that water at certain times to then create enough moisture content in the soils that then you can establish those those crops, and probably more along the lines, as he said, for forage, because you can utilize the amount of, and when I say forage, more for grazing rather than actual forage for hay. But obviously, if you can get forage for hay and then come back and do some grazing, that even that's an added economic benefit. And at the bottom line is the economics have to come around. So it's either you're benefiting from purely at the ground level, the farm level, or it's a broader societal benefit, dust mitigation, all of those other things. And when you start getting at that level, is bringing additional funding back.
Thanks, Cork. So Reyn, I want to bring it down to the Tule Basin now with you, and this kind of tees off of some of the themes that Cork just talked about. So the Tule Basin has kind of been out in front on looking at demand management already right now as a component of the portfolio for getting to groundwater sustainability. And some of the groundwater sustainability agencies there have already started incentivizing growers to participate in land fallowing in ways that are going to bring down, to manage groundwater use, but also you're encouraging them to manage the lands in a way that doesn't generate problems with weeds and dust. And so wondering if you could talk a little bit about what how it's working, what you're learning so far from that.
Yeah, so just to sort of contextualize some of the conversation. So the Tule Subbasin includes within it 2 GSAs that are leading, in my opinion, leading the charge on a lot of these land fallowing policies and corresponding programs. And those have been the Lower Tule River GSA and Pixley GSA. And there's some simple things that have occurred that I've noticed have enabled some really cool programs to sort of blossom out of the space. One of which is a really simple land fallowing policy that's being trialed in Pixley and Lower Tule. And it essentially, because the region is utilizing a remote sensing ET model to sort of account for folks' water consumption on their crops.
Just sorry, Reyn, tell people what ET is.
Oh, evapotranspiration. I'm sorry. Right. So just to take one step farther back. So you're flying over with some sort of sensor, satellite, plane, whatever it may be, and you're measuring essentially how much water is coming off of the ground, either through evaporation or through plant transpiration. The standing hypothesis being that plants will transpire more than the bare soil, which is largely one of the reasons why disking is so prevalent in some of these fallowed lands. Now that we've laid that quick foundation, there's a key trial policy that was put into play late last year, which is a land fallowing policy, which allowed landowners to come into the GSA and draw polygons essentially around their land and say, we're going to fallow this land. And they're going to plan and they're going to coordinate with the district to do that. As sort of a reward for that, that landowner is not going to be charged their full water allotment, their ET, right? So that lost water off of the property corresponding with vegetation in this instance. And this really simple policy has sort of paved the way to what I think are 2 really cool actions. One of which is a program led by the Nature Conservancy and a new land trust. And those 2 entities together are developing a pilot program that will allow corporate sponsors that are aiming to meet their ESG goals, environmental, social, and governmental, right? They're meeting their ESG objectives, in this case, water. And they're essentially coming in and they're asking farmers to retire that water right, which is allowing it to sit in the ground. Correspondingly, the policy allows landowners to come in and cover crop on the top of that ground without like an evapotranspiration punishment. So these things start to work cohesively and allows sort of like a simple policy with a simple amount of momentum is sort of allowing us to kind of come in and develop a land fallowing and cover crop program. Additionally, and I'm going to get off track, but additionally, some of these contexts really are sort of paving the way to like long-term fallowing, right, and restoration and repurposing, which is ultimately probably going to be one of the key sort of arrows in the quiver as we move forward. So they'll sort of line up behind one or a couple of key policies and actions. And it's great to see from a cover cropping perspective what can occur. So I'll keep you posted.
Thank you. That's terrific. All eyes are watching. So now we're going to move up the east side. We're driving up 99 toward Chowchilla, and go over to Mark. And Mark, you're in. It's not the wettest area on Katie's maps, but it's in a kind of better area than certainly than where Cork is or where Reyn is. So this is an area where there might be more success with dryland crops than in some of those other places. And you're doing some really interesting thinking about the supply and the demand side together, in terms of managing risk and thinking about how to improve groundwater levels. So it's going to get us to talk a little bit about recharge. So can you give folks a little sense, you just took 40 acres of walnuts out. Why are you doing dryland farming right now instead of immediately planting a new orchard? Tell us a little bit about the formula there.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks for having me. Did take out 40 acres, and this isn't the first recharge project that I've had in my history, but working with the NRCS and the local RCD, we have a new executive director that's pretty aggressive as far as outreach to growers. And talking to growers, they're very excited about doing recharge. And they want to know the management tools or the management processes to do that. And so part of that is having growers come out, but also showing them how wheat or forage crops can be utilized on a recharge area. So, and I look back on the history of NRCS and it's like, yeah, the Dust Bowl, they had the same problems and they were able to start managing those problems. So history does repeat itself. So as far as the grain crop, it serves multiple purposes. One, hopefully an income. Two, it can be sacrificed. I think Kate or Andrew were saying that it can be sacrificed if you do have excess water flows like in 2017 or 2019. It can lower the dust. It can be farmed in a strip manner to where I don't plant the whole thing to grain. I might do a natural cover crop or weeds and do grain on other parts and just rotate back and forth disking and harvesting. It just gives me more options. And that's what's exciting to me as a grower. I can still do what I want to do on my farm. I just need more management practices in my toolbox. And the air district is helpful. Thank you, John, for the whole orchard recycling grant I got. And the NRCS is helpful with their EQIP program and now their recharge pilot grant program. Department of Conservation, they have some grants in Madera County now, which to me, this is just my 2 cents worth. If we're going to be taking out a lot of trees and going into grain, taking out trees is very expensive. And it would help the farmers to use some of that grant money to get the trees out so they can go into grain. Otherwise, it's $1,000 just to take the trees out. And if you recycle it, it's probably $1,500, $1,600. So that's an expense that really can't be got back if you go into grain. So you can tell I'm passionate about recharge. I think it opens up a lot of options, a lot of good management practices, not only for groundwater quality, groundwater amounts, subsidence, everything. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's great, Mark. And just, follow up kind of like I asked Cork. So, right now you're using the dryland wheat as a sort of flex tool while you're setting things up so that you can accommodate recharge. If water remains limited in your area, could you imagine using this flex approach kind of on a wider scale?
If the economics present themselves, 500,000 acres of forage crops coming into the system is going to have a supply and demand issue with the dairies or the horse people, whoever uses it. So it's going to be not only that, but going back to Reyn and Andrew, it's how do we get the organic material back in the soil to hold that soil? And what's interesting about this whole orchard recycling, I left my sensors in, and darn if those sensors aren't flat. I'm not losing water in my ground because it's full of chips. And so if it started off at 60 centibars, it's still 60 centibars, and it's August, almost August. So adding organic matter, using some water to develop more organic matter through cover crops will hold that soil in place quite a bit. The more we disturb it, we lose that to volatilization. So there's a lot of options that can be done.
Thanks, Mark. So I want us to have time to move on to funding questions, but because that's been a kind of recurrent theme. But before we do that, just for anybody else on the panel, any additional thoughts you want to add on sort of integrating the recharge piece into the demand management side of things, and sort of, I don't know, Reyn, is that part of how folks are thinking about things down in Tule, for example?
Yeah, I don't know how far you want to run down that particular thread.
About a minute and a half worth.
Sure. Yeah, okay, that's perfect. So just looking again specifically in the Tule Subbasin, we're looking pretty heavily on these sort of repurposing practices that largely encompass the removal of irrigation from parcels of land. Sort of coincidingly, the other side of shifting that water accounting budget has been increasingly looking at localized water recharge. Now there's what's becoming increasingly interesting that I'm seeing develop in the Tule Subbasin and corresponding GSAs is really the acceptance of strategic local recharge, right? So obviously when we have scenarios where lots of agriculturalists and basins can take water, everyone should be trying to pull as much water, sometimes sacrificing a wheat field to get that water into the ground. But what the interesting decision matrix starts to happen when there's less water. And when there's less water, that's where I'm starting to see policy shift is deployment of recharge where it's most critical, like around communities. So maintaining sort of local aquifers, I think is really going to play a part with not just recharge, cover cropping, land retirement. I think that linkage is going to start to settle into these key geographies where all practices will be foundational. But I'm sure we'll have a different conversation another time about that.
Great. Thanks, Reyn. Cork, did you have a couple, any something short to add on the recharge piece? You kind of evoked it earlier.
Yeah, I think, there's definitely, as Reyn had said, I mean, it is that targeted recharge on the west side. Some issues we have with just flood recharge basins is the existence of selenium and some of the things that are in the soil that cause other issues. And so I think where some of that recharge that's being done is using recharge wells and recharging the aquifer that way, which it doesn't quite get us to that soil moisture issue, but it does help with the basin.
Thanks. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit. Let's go a little deeper on the funding, which everybody I think agrees is going to be key to help kind of make all of this work in a good way. So John, you've gotten some acknowledgments and some thanks from folks on the panel already about some of the partnerships that the Air District has been having with growers on these things. So just, beyond, you got your CMPs, you got sort of the regulatory side of things, but then you've also got incentive programs, and just, wondering if you could share a little bit more about some lessons learned from some of your past or current efforts to help managers implement dust management practices, and what opportunities you see moving forward.
Great, thanks, Ellen. And Mark, happy to hear that you took advantage of the grant program for the whole orchard recycling. That's great. It's been a very successful program. But yeah, just to touch on the funding side, absolutely, it's key. We have a number of regulations that we implement and enforce, but incentive programs is a huge part of our operations too, to help cover the cost of different industries or growers wanting to get involved in some of these other practices. Andrew mentioned it in his presentation, but one of our successful programs has been getting more equipment out there for low dust nut harvesters. almond harvesting, walnut harvesting can contribute to localized dust concerns when those operations are happening. We saw the technology for these types of harvesters developing over time, where there are a lot of low dust options out there. So we set up a program to provide funding to help growers purchase these low dust options and get those out there. And so through the development of that program, we've spent over $13 million so far. In this program, we've implemented over 160 new devices out there, new harvesters to replace the old higher emitting devices. And we're really happy about that. And that program continues. Andrew mentioned our ag burn phase out program as well. If you don't know, this is another big transition happening in the valley, where open ag burning is being phased out over the coming years, where by January of 2025, open ag burning will be virtually gone in the San Joaquin Valley. And so we've received a significant amount of state funding, about $180 million in the past year, to support that transition that Mark was talking about, where we provide funding for different growers to recycle their orchard back into the land. There's a lot of benefits from that. It comes at a high cost, though. It's not cheap. It's a lot more expensive than just open burning the material. So through that program, a lot of people are taking advantage of that. We're reducing smoke, of course, from burning the material. That's another program that's been successful, but it takes a lot of state funding, grant funding to support these transitions. So what I perceive from the Sigma implementation with all the fallow land, if we can identify practices that do work here in the Valley, and we identify what that cost is if cost is just the barrier, then absolutely setting up your program with funding to help support the ag community to develop these new practices and to make it sustainable is absolutely vital to make it successful.
Thanks, John. So now, Reyn, I want to come back to you on funding, because you're implementing down in the Tule Basin one of the first of these new grants from this new program that I think Andrew mentioned from the Department of Conservation on multi-benefit farmland repurposing. Is that right? Something like that. Anyway, tell us a little bit about how that's working and how you're using that to incentivize things that should happen.
Yeah, so just to kick things off, the multi-benefit land repurposing program is a Department of Conservation funded program. This was the pilot year, I believe 4 programs throughout the state of California were sort of sprung up through this initial wave of funding, all of which have their own sort of flavor and teams and dynamics. In the Tule Subbasin in particular, we actually implemented a pretty interesting approach, in my opinion. Obviously I'm biased, but we sort of took our basin as a whole and started to develop we're starting to develop a land retirement plan at that scale, but sort of ahead of time, we already can kind of identify fundamental regions that will have high rates of land repurposing and stress associated economic, environmental, et cetera, in those geographies. So the program really focuses in on those geographies. That program comes in and funds planning and land retirement efforts in those key geographies, including outreach efforts, a lot of community engagement threads woven through the process. But I think what makes it additionally interesting is we actually maintained a block of implementation funds in the order of around $3.5 million. And so this team of the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, UC Merced, Self-Help, the Tule Basin Network, et cetera, the Land Trust. This team identified a suite of projects that we had to deliver now in those geographies. And then we left this block. So through outreach and engagement, we'd be able to sort of compile a regiment of actions that we could nest against the program. Probably in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll be compiling a suite of projects to really deliver a more, hopefully, more innovative strategies for land repurposing. So that's the dynamic sort of around that program. And I'm happy to answer any questions if folks have follow-up thoughts.
Thanks, that's terrific. So my colleague from behind the scenes has been sending me audience questions already. And so I think we're going to have more than we can have time to answer in the Q&A. So I want us to pivot over to that now. And so just remind those who haven't sent in questions yet, if you'd like to, please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com and say who you are and where you're from if you can, so we can acknowledge you. And I'd like to also bring back up Katie and Andrew to join for this round of Q&A. Hi, everybody. Hi, back. Okay. So where do we start? Let's talk about, there was a question early on about what besides winter wheat could we be thinking about in terms of sort of dry land or water limited cropping. And I think, there was a story in the news recently about agave, for example. Katie, I know you have thoughts on this, but I want to also offer if anybody else on the panel has things they want to say after Katie. Katie, go ahead and give us a start on that.
Sure, there are lots of things that we could look into further, and I think everybody has their favorite pet dryland crop. But just to name a few, there are leguminous crops like chickpeas and lentils that are quite common in other dryland areas. Things like safflower, which is really it's grown here as a summer crop, but there's been some testing as to whether it might serve also as a winter crop and potentially a forage crop. Right now, it's mostly used for oil. And then there are other great forage crops other than wheat, things like triticale, some really salt hardy, water hardy forage crops that we can look into more. And then you can get into your more novel crops and sort of your desert adapted things that aren't your traditional winter crops, but are certainly dryland, things like agave, things like guayule, which is the rubber plant. There's a very long list of things to experiment with.
Okay, so there's another related question, and maybe I'm going to toss this one to Reyn, which is that earlier question was from Morgan Chow at the Delta Stewardship Council. Thank you, Morgan. This one is from Chelsea Spear with the Northern Central Region Office of the Department of Water Resources, wondering about research and into the feasibility, costs, and water requirements of establishing native plants rather than crops like wheat. And Reyn, that's right up your alley right now. Tell us a little bit.
That's a pretty phenomenal pivot from this conversation. So I don't want to get too soapboxy here, but in a very simple way of saying this, as we evaluate land repurposing efforts in the San Joaquin Valley and the state as a whole in response to the SGMA demands, it's physically impossible currently to do a scalable restoration action, regardless of the amount of money that we have. So there's just not enough native seeds and supplies and practitioners to execute, according to PPIC's numbers, 500,000 to 1 million acres of land repurposing or restoration through those models. So it's becoming, I think the state of California is at large starting to come to grips with the reality of we don't even have enough material to do the action that we think we want to do. And so, yeah, you're touching on a pretty interesting thread there. As I look at, we're doing the Caponero Creek restoration project in the Tule Subbasin, which is 465 acres of restoration. If you're a restorationist, you're like, 465 acres is enormous. And then if you're like a policy person, you're like, that's not going to do anything. And even for that 465 acres, we're under-equipped. We don't have material. So I do think there's a huge nexus for collaboration and driving on this point. I could start a whole nother meeting on this. But anyway, you're on an interesting thread. And I think there's a lot of, there's some strong synergies between native plant development and sort of addressing this landscape in the future. Thanks,
Reyn. Okay, so this is an interesting one from Brett Sanders with 3 Core up in Chico. The word biochar is one that we're starting to hear more and more. And I don't know, maybe John, maybe this one is for you, but others on the panel, let me know if you want to weigh in on this. Is there viability for biochar to be used on these fallowed lands to reduce dust, to help with water retention, et cetera? And it is, kind of raising the question about whether there's a critical need for biomass processing facilities in the context of changes that we're looking at.
Yeah, it's a good question, something that we've been tracking, thinking about too. We've heard that comment a lot, that all the benefits of biochar. Biochar can be produced through processes where you can get rid of ag waste, and woody material. Instead of open burning, you go through a different process to capture some of that energy, and then the product can be biochar. And yeah, we understand that if it's applied to land, it can help improve the quality of that soil. It can help retain moisture. A lot of benefits from that. I know there are a lot of projects that are in development or being planned that can help produce that type of material through, instead of open burning the woody waste, we're trying to get energy out of it, gasifying it. That can, in the end, produce quite a bit of this biochar material, which, you know, could be some benefit there to apply it to land. And we're getting the kind of a benefit of reducing emissions through taking care of that material. Then we're getting an output of some other product that can be beneficial as well.
Thank you. This one I want to toss to Cork and to Mark, a little bit more on kind of from grower land manager perspective, what would make the kind of programs that are out there right now, say the SWEEP program from California Department of Food and Agriculture, EQIP, or, you know, some of the NRCS and other USDA programs, what would make them more helpful right now in the context of the challenges you're facing? Mark, you want to go first?
Sure. I mentioned the whole orchard recycling grant. That's about $600 an acre. To remove the trees, walnut trees are more aggressive, you know, bigger roots than almonds. That's more like $1,200 an acre to remove them. And so I'm going to be at a loss as far as money, as just by not going back into trees. So I think if we're talking about removing permanent crops out of production, more money needs to be available to the growers to help them remove those permanent crops out of production and whole orchard recycle them. That'll hold the dust quite well and retain moisture in the ground, retain erosion. If it's in a slope, it'll hold the moisture and the turbidity won't go downstream. The NRCS EQIP grant I got for putting in the flood system. I mean, we took out our flood systems over the last 40 years because we're going micros and drip irrigation. Who needs the flood anymore? So to put a flood system back that we might use only every 5 years when there is excess flow, it would be good to have more money in the EQIP program or in a pilot grant program to do that. Same with the return system. You have to keep the water moving. If it's flooding and you're trying to recharge it, especially if there's trees on it, you want to keep that water moving. This field that I took out flooded in 2006. The water ran for 3 weeks. We kept the water moving. We didn't lose a tree. So you got to keep that water moving. So the grant money's helpful, but for specifically doing it for recharge, I like the idea of incentivizing the growers to help them get over this learning curve. I'm excited about recharge because I've done it. Other growers are wondering about it, but they haven't done it. And I believe once we help them to do it, it becomes a standard management practice that they will want to keep doing. And so if that money can be made more available quicker, it's like the SWEEP grant you mentioned. I tried to apply for a SWEEP grant, but I needed to do a efficiency on my boosters for my district water. There was no district water. And this year we had district water for 10 days. I couldn't get the tester out to test my booster. So I can't go for the SWEEP grant to get a VFD on my booster. So the grants are a little bit tough sometimes to navigate, and they take a long time. I tried to do a conservation innovation grant with my recharge project and finally gave up and went to EQIP, which was able to go faster. And that lost about 2 years. So I think it would be nice if the grant money could go more local to the water districts or the GSAs, where they can distribute that money faster and more efficiently, and not have too many hoops to jump through. Like, let's get the growers learning about recharge first, and then go into habitat, and then go into different things. But if we have to do A, B, C, and D in order to get the grant money, we get confused and lose interest. So if we can concentrate on recharge and maybe holding that those orchards in the ground with whole orchard recycling, help them there. I think it'll go a lot faster.
Thanks, Mark. Cork, did you want to add anything on what would
Yeah,
help?
I think Mark really hit the nail on the head is simplification of these programs. I mean, it's always a challenge entering into any of these government programs, the amount of paperwork and the time. I mean, we had this year, for one of our projects, we were doing an orchard recycling program through CDFA, and we were approved in February. They told us we should be able to start the removal in June. They weren't ready. And the last communication we had was you can start in August. We backed out. We can't wait anymore because, that just sitting there and they wouldn't let us start. For example, I mean, we could have started the process, documented removing trees and doing everything. We couldn't even start the project. And so you lose all this time. And that's the critical part when you're in the private sector. Time is absolutely money. And so, making these programs a little more efficient, I think Mark really makes a good point. Getting the money to a local organization that then has a little more flexibility that can react and work with local growers, I think is really, really important. The other issue is scale. I mean, we're talking, potentially 500,000 acres or more. And now not all of that's going to be trees. So, there's going to be a lot less of that's trees, but any of these projects, whether it's recharge or any of these things, it's a really large scale. And most of these programs have fairly small limits on what you can do. And I understand it, there's this hesitancy to benefit larger growers, but the public benefit that comes from this, I really think that needs to be explored, is how do we, not disadvantage smaller growers, but get the most bang for the buck.
Great. Okay. We're running out of time here, guys, and lady. And so we're gonna move to a quick lightning round. And this is, I think I've heard some signs of optimism and hope, even though there've been some challenges we've talked about too. So this is the very quick 30 seconds. What gives you hope for successfully managing this big transition in the Valley? And I'm just gonna go around the room on my screen as you appear. So Reyn, you're up first.
Sure, that one's easy for me. So it's sociological. I've been really grateful and encouraged by landscape partners, project partners, flexible thinking, the ability to empathize with other positions, despite like an emotional load that comes with resource scarcity. So it's really the ability to have, flexible dialogue and sort of operate in a very mature, deliberate fashion that I think is going to propel. I think it's going to propel the region to success in this regard.
Thank you, Mark. How about you? What gives you hope?
Well, I'm hopeful in speaking with growers in the field and on Zoom calls, they are interested and a little bit excited about recharge, and that'll make the shallow wall tables higher. It'll improve water quality for our disadvantaged communities, lessen subsidence. Migratory birds will come in. We won't need to drill the big deep wells anymore. We can mine the shallow well aquifer that we can recharge. We can decrease the salts. We can decrease the nitrates. And all we need to do is really concentrate on reaching out to the growers on the management practices needed. So, and that's exciting. That's a new thing. Growers like to move dirt and build things. So that's what we do.
Thank you, Mark. John, how about you?
I would say that we've always seen a significant amount of innovation from the ag community and things that we've worked on with them, whether it's replacing tractors with newer equipment, nut harvesters, phasing out open ag burning, these huge transitional things that have come up. They've always stepped up, figured it out. They were at the table to come up with solutions. And I see this as another big challenge, of course, facing the Valley in California, and I am optimistic that we'll see a lot of innovation again with the community on this.
Thanks, John. And Cork.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and we've got a lot of there's significant challenges, and I think the ag community is definitely stepping up, and as these realities and Sigma is being implemented, and those realities are coming home to the broader group. And as Reyn had touched on, is just the willingness of all the partners to get involved and come up with broad based solutions.
Well, so I'm gonna speak on behalf of Katie and Andrew and myself and the rest of the team, that what gives us hope is the ability to work with folks like you, who really are inspiring and help make it engaging to really think about creative solutions. So thank you to all of you. Thanks to Katie and Andrew for your great presentations. Thanks to our funders for supporting this important work. And thanks to everybody for joining us today online. If you pre-registered, you're going to get a survey. We'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to answer it and let us know how we did. That helps us improve. Thanks again. Be safe and have a great afternoon.